7. Extramarital. Our Doris has been removed from the garden safari. She received the letter this morning when she were eating her poached eggs. I thought she'd choked on a shell. Her throat closed up and her eyes squinted and her lips were screwed up that tight they'd have done a good job keeping the Tower of London locked. Her face were near and gone beetroot when she wailed like a banshee and said to me, she screamed, "Who does Janice Dooley think she is? Her biggest claim to fame is that she can still walk after spending all the time on her back. If she hadn't been sleeping with Doug Gray, then she would never have been given the garden safari. I should have listened to my mother. She told me to meet someone with money in his pocket, and what did I do? I married for love. Love! It was the 1960s. I could have been Paul McCartney's bit on the side, could have put aside my differences and set foot in Liverpool. But no, I married a man who thought to hide a pair of secateurs in the Collins English Dictionary. I thought it probably weren't best to take another bite of my toast. Thought the crunch might make the silence that bit more awkward than it already were, and I said to her, I don't think the dictionary had anything to do with it, Our Doris. You still would have attacked that journalist. He wasn't a journalist. He were the only person at the Gazette who had paper in his notepad and a fully functioning pencil. And I only beat him with the secateurs. It's not like I used them to chop off his threepenny bits. She folded the letter up and set it back in the envelope. Her nose scrunched up then. Her eyes seemed to roll back in her head and she sniffed the air as though she were testing for gas. I said to her, "What's up, Our Doris?" She held up her hand and shushed me before she lifted the envelope to her nose and sniffed along the edge of the torn paper. Our Doris went straight to the look and said to me, "You'll never guess what that lemon tart has gone and done, Harold. At least when I spray scent on me correspondence, it's nothing as cheap as Dove's cucumber antiperspirant." And Our Doris did something I never thought she'd do. She flung the envelope across the room and watched it sail right into the pound-stretcher plant pot her Mavis bought me as a Christmas present. I did something I never thought I'd do. It could have been equal parts heroic and incredibly stupid. I creaked my chair back so it made that sound that goes through you like olive oil, and I retrieved the letter. It definitely had some funny scent about it. It prickled at your nostrils like hay when me and Our Doris used to go and frolic in Mr. Sterling's fields. It were the 60s and we couldn't always afford the flicks. I fetched the letter back to my seat and read it aloud. It read, "Dear Mrs. Copeland, after much deliberation, the committee has decided that unfortunately we are going to have to remove your house from the garden safari due to its association with you and the recent scandal surrounding your name. Sincerely yours, Ms. Janice Dooley." I shook my head and said to Our Doris, "She's got some cheek, hasn't she? She's created enough scandal herself." Our Doris looked me dead straight in the eye then, like Clint Eastwood in the final showdown, and she said to me, "There's no scandal. There's no love child, Harold. Janice Dooley finally has the chance to build something of a career for herself. It was intimated to me by none other than Pandora O'Malley that Janice thinks she can make it onto one of these reality shows. She's in talks with a prominent production company to record a pilot episode of Little Street Goes Large. Apparently she'll be the front page news in the Partridge Mews Gazette." I knew my jaw had dropped. My dentures were practically on my lap. I said to Our Doris, "You'll have to tell someone, Our Doris." She set her shoulders back and placed her hands demurely on the table before fixing one eye with the look, and she said to me, she replied, "We do not stoop to the level of a certain Miss Dooley. One does not need to make one's intentions public in order to fuel the fire. I have a meeting with the only other person in this town capable of informing folk of the truth in the correct fashion." If my jaw were going to drop any more, it'd be around my ankles. I shook my head, convinced that I would have something of a heart attack, or stroke, or one of those things that stop me from enjoying vanilla slices, and I said to her, "You don't mean her." I choked out the last word. I couldn't speak the name, as though the monster would rise like Beetlejuice if the name was said enough. And Our Doris nodded once, a curt offering, her face practically trembling because we knew what this meant, and she said to me, "Violet Grey will arrive at 12:30 for a light lunch of a chicken salad with new potatoes." No doubt I'd be sent off down to the pub, and I thought the pint was well needed. If Our Doris and Violet Grey were teaming up with one another, then Janice Dooley of Little Street would have hell to pay. When Violet arrived, I knew the situation must be more serious than I thought. She showed up in a taxi with a briefcase in one hand, carrying 2 coffees in a polystyrene cup holder from Starbucks. She was dressed like Claire Balding in a beige 2-piece suit, feminine, but she could have knocked out a horse at 10 paces. When I greeted her at the door, she said to me, eyelashes fluttering, smelling like the lavender air freshener Our Doris uses on the bins, she said, "Good morning, Harold. It is a rather sombre moment when we must meet under such unfortunate and distressing circumstances as these. Our Doris had dressed for the occasion. She appeared at the kitchen door in a mauve dress with the bon marche cardigan she says gives just the air of melancholy required in serious situations. When Nigel fell off the roof in the Archers, I thought she'd forever be an apparition in cream wool. In the jewellery department, she'd settled for her false pearl earrings and the gold chain around her throat I'd bought for her 43rd birthday. Violet, I'm so glad you came. I don't know what I could do without you. From the look she gave Violet, I'm surprised she weren't up for an Oscar. She gave this look through the door of the living room, and it were a look unlike I'd ever seen before. It was sad, but there was a determined set in her shoulders, and as her right hand reached out for the door jamb, she gave this hollow stare at herself in the mirror, and in that moment I thought, you've been married for nigh on half a century, Harold, and you never knew your wife could do this. She owned the stage as she approached us, making wistful looks at the photos of Angela and Theo and assorted family members across the walls. She reached Violet and I was suddenly furniture. The briefcase and coffees ended up in my hands like I were nothing more than a hat stand. And Violet took our Doris's hands in hers and said to her, she said, "Don't you worry about this, Doris. We've dealt with worse things. Remember when Manuela Esperanza wanted to open a tapas bar in the town centre? Where did she wind up? Rensley. Some think I was wrong in offering Janice to a place as head of the garden safari. After all, she is not part of the Partridge Mews Women's Institute. Some might think her unfit for the position, if words are spoken in the correct places." From the look Violet Grey gave me at that point, I knew exactly what I was part of. They were setting the scene, making me a part of their underhandedness. I, Harold Copeland, had been drawn in to see this. Like children on a playground when someone wore the wrong day's underwear, the ladies of Partridge Mews would be forced to turn on Janice or face the wrath of our Doris. I've been married to her for a long time, and I love her. But when someone crosses her, it's like watching a nuclear explosion when you're nothing more than a cockroach. Our Doris looked at me, her eyes not even fully open. She shook her head like she were trying to get hair out of her eyes, hair that's impossible to get in her eyes the amount of Silvakrinned she uses, and she said to me, she said, "I think it best if you make yourself scarce, dear. I wouldn't want you to hear anything you shouldn't." Violet pretended that she'd forgotten I was there, and suddenly I were ousted from the house, coat and wallet thrust into my arms without our Doris questioning what I looked like, and I thought to myself, she's done it on purpose, wants folk to think as she's too upset to focus on the fact her husband is out wearing his brown brogues with his navy trousers. I went to the only place I could think of in these situations, the Hare and Horse. When I arrived, they ended up waiting for 20 minutes before the doors opened. Alf arrived about quarter of an hour into me first half and came down and sat down without a drink in front of him, an expectant look on his face. He said to me, "You know, I'd have thought your Doris would have stopped you drinking and driving. It's not in fashion nowadays, Harold." I opened my wallet and handed him a tenner, saying to him, I said, "When our Doris has Violet Bleeding Grey round our house discussing war tactics, I think I'm owed a bitter." And Alf said to me, he said, "Things must be getting bad if you're willing to throw away a tenner just to get me off your back." When he was stood at the bar, I started to feel meddlesome, and I shouted across the pub, I said, "Alf, mine's a pint. I'll walk home." If our Doris wanted folk to think we were in a bit of disarray, what better way to show 'em I wouldn't get drunk? I'd get a bit merry, maybe go as far as not knowing which way me legs were turning, and I'd go home. Alf put the pint down in front of me as I finished with the half. "You're working through them a bit quickly, aren't you?" "All I can say to the Alf is that Janice Dooley would be better off doing a midnight flit. Our Doris isn't happy that she stole her thunder. You know she were trying hard for Fifth House, and well, it didn't do Janice any favours when she went and did that photo shoot at Tatton Park wearing nothing but a fur coat." I gulped back the pint, barely noticing the flavour until it were gone. "Aye, that caused a right stir at quiz night, I can tell you. Some of the young uns had a photos on dartboard." Alf shuddered as though someone had electrocuted his spine and said to me, he said, "The sight of her neckline were enough to put you off your pork scratchings. I know our Edith ain't happy. She said it would have been all well and good if she'd done it for charity, or tastefully, but wearing her grandmother's fur coat. Did you know she wore that when women won the vote? Our Edith were beside herself when she got the newspaper clippings up on our Martin's computer. Our Doris says that she's going for a television show." Alf shook his head. "Don't believe any of that, Harold. I've had it off Wilkie Poynton himself. Janice has been telling all those that'll listen at the Harrington that the only person she's spoken to is someone from an agency." I sat bolt upright in my seat. I went that fast I thought I must have cured my sciatica. I said to Alf, I said, "What agency?" It could have been a letting agency for all I know. I'm sure you'll read all about it in the Gazette this week when she and the long-lost love child of Mr. Gadsden have their interview. She's a hot topic, is Janice Dooley of Little Street, really milking her 15 minutes of fame. I tell you, Harold, it'll come to nothing. But he needn't have said anything. All plans for getting merry went out of my head, but I still walked home. Alf were going off to the allotments to see if he could score any carrots off Richard Pegg. He's got a lot left over now his Dorothea has gone off to the glue factory in the sky, and I set about walking home. Back in the 60s, when all the trouble first started between Our Doris and Janice, everyone thought something must have happened in those months when Janice disappeared. I remember my mum thinking it was something to do with Janice keeping her head in the sand for the sake of her mother. Cynthia Dooley of Little Street was a figurehead in Partridge Mews, a matriarch, proper Ena Sharples type character. She once had a slanging match with my mother that lasted for 20 minutes during an air raid. Apparently she hadn't returned one of Cynthia's hot water bottles, and that would have been fine had her auntie in New Zealand not just dropped dead in a motorbike accident, and she was sure it were a sign from the good Lord himself that she should see as her hot water bottle were returned. Either way, hot water bottle were given back and no more was said about it. Well, her blood pressure must have constantly been simmering in her veins, because in 1950 she had an heart attack, and after that were warned she shouldn't ever get too hot under the collar, otherwise she might kill herself. Her heart did stop in the end, but that were due to the fact she choked on a mint imperial doing the ironing. My mother maintained it were an excellent way to go, as it proved that Cynthia were a proper housewife, determined to keep her house tidy even in the throes of death. Her high blood pressure had everyone worried, and that's why we all assumed Janice Dooley had been shipped off for a few months. There'd never been a sign of any love child before. Mr. Gadsden himself only died a few months back, mid-90s and still able to fasten his shoelaces. And the recent arrival of a possible heir would question who'd take control of the factory. If Janice Dooley did have a child, then I don't know why she'd keep him a secret for nearly 50 years. She were the first one to brag about paper knickers on the number 38 to crew. I'd hung on to a bit of information, and as I wandered through the front door it stood fixed in my head as something I had to tell Our Doris, because as much as I didn't want to see Janice Dooley victim of a witch hunt, I didn't want to see my wife lose her place of fifth house after we'd gone through so much to achieve it. Our Doris sat at the kitchen table, her head were in her hands. She looked up at me and I can tell this weren't acting. There was still a fight there, but it were hidden very far beneath the bundles of that bon marche cardie. I sat down and I said to her, I've heard something I think you need to hear. She looked up at me and said, it better be more than Violet Grey has to offer. Apparently Janice Dooley has said that if anything goes wrong, she will reveal that she has been having an affair with Doug for the last 20 years. I nodded, and I were excited. My heart were going 10 to the dozen. I thought I had wild horses in my veins. I questioned whether it could have been the bitter. If it had reached my chest and I were about to slump over on the table we spent the best part of 3 months looking for. I said to Our Doris, there were fire in my blood, and I said to her, Janice Dooley's been speaking to an agency. Our Doris mumbled then, and she never mumbles, has been known to enunciate even when cursed with tonsillitis. She said, about the reality show, I know. I said to her, could it be an escort agency? Our Doris's head turned as though it were a periscope, and she said to me, go on, Harold, you must have more than that. I nodded, and I were on a roll then. My thoughts were tumbling out like milk onto cereal. I said, Mr. Gadsden died a few months ago, leaving no conceivable heir but a considerable amount of the company to one of his associates. If an heir came along, surely they would be entitled to some of the money. Janice Dooley disappeared, but she's always talked about birth control. Remember, she volunteered to give talks to the old folks about contraception. She's been handed the Garner safari, and being friends with the Greys would show that she was still part of the social circle that included Mr. Gadsden, even though their affair came out all of those years ago, meaning there was every chance that she could have had a child, and for whatever reason she and Mr. Gadsden hushed it up. Our Doris flung herself to her feet, chair slamming to the floor, the triumphant gleam in her eyes, and as soon as it appeared, it vanished. She'd picked up her chair. Now we need proof. We need to get into Little Street. The envelope was still on the table between the cruets. I picked it up and wafted it in front of Our Doris's face. Keep that away from me, Arold. You know I can't cope with the smell. I said, she left you a letter, Our Doris. It's practically an invitation to talk. We have our way in. Our Doris grinned like the Cheshire Cat on speed and said to me, Harold Copeland, I knew there were a reason I married for love. I know what it was. It were me dashing good looks. The smile slipped slightly as she nodded, her eyes searching for somewhere else to work. Yes, I suppose that must have accounted for something. Little Street is a den of iniquity. There's an off-licence on the corner that will serve under 18s as long as they're not wearing the school uniform, and everyone seems to own a pit bull. It's one of those streets. I know I've been married to Our Doris for a while. Some might think that's turned me into a bit of a snob, might have me questioning my sensibilities, might say that this is the world I came from and they'd be wrong. I might have worn hand-me-downs to school, and my mother might have enjoyed a pint of stout every now and then, but never would she ever have let her doorstep get as filthy as some of the steps you find down Little Street. They're practically black. I know there've been government cuts, but that doesn't mean you can't get out the hot water in a bit of Jay's fluid. I pulled up right outside Janice Dooley's, worried for the safety of my tyres. I have to say, I have never been more astonished by a house, and that includes at the time I saw a shanty town on Comic Relief. If Cynthia Dooley were alive today, she'd have a heart attack. She'd be dead. She'd take one look at the house and that'd be it. She'd be passed out in the gutter amongst the empty Carlsberg cans and what looked like the remnants of a kebab. All the paint on the front door had chipped. The letterbox had been boarded over, the net curtains were nicotine stained, and there were dog ends of cigarettes all over the front step. I thought something I never thought I'd think. It crossed my mind and I latched onto it like a fly to dog muck. Me and Doris were the lucky ones. I said to Our Doris, I said, "Are you sure you can go in there, Our Doris?" She waved her white cotton gloves in my face and said to me, she said, "Harold, I once went into a loft that hadn't been looked at in over 20 years. There were 30 dead bats, a mummified parakeet, and the remains of several of Maeve Binch's early works. I am trained in the art of tact." And with that, she stepped up to the front door. After 3 sharp raps, the door opened to reveal Janice Dooley bedecked in nothing more than a nylon kimono with egg yolk stains all over the chest. When she saw Our Doris, this look crossed her face. Something between confusion, glee and constipation, and she said to us, using this false tone as though she'd swallowed fabric conditioner, she said, "I cannot say I'm surprised by you coming here, but I have to say I won't be swayed from my position. I and a few select members of the group..." "Committee," Our Doris said, "and I quite understand your position, Janice." "Miss Dooley." Our Doris nodded then, and inclined her head to the right, and if I'd ever seen more of a look on her eye of being concussed, she said to Janice, she said, "Miss Dooley, I understand your position, as do so many others across Partridge, Mews. You must have seen more ceilings than half the plasterers in town. May we come in?" Janice's face had practically turned to aubergine, and she said to Our Doris, opening the door a bit wider, she said, "You must be upset, Mrs. Copeland. Do you come in?" The first thing I noticed was the smell. She definitely liked her Dove antiperspirant, did Janice Dooley. But there were undertones of tobacco, ale and musk, as though the windows hadn't been opened since 1984. She led us into the sitting room. An armchair by the window were covered in newspapers, and there were the makings of a sandwich on top of the television. I chose a dining chair as Our Doris perched on the edge of one of the chairs that sagged more than Anne Widdecombe's jowls, and Janice piped up with, she said, "I'll just go and get changed into something decent." Our Doris offered a simpering gaze and said to her, she said, "If you've not found anything in the last 70 years, it's probably best to stop looking." Janice nodded and headed off upstairs. I said to Our Doris, I said, "It's a bit of a rum place, isn't it? I don't remember it being like this when Cynthia had hold of it." But Our Doris were on her feet again. She said to me, she said, "We've less than 5 minutes to find evidence of an escort agency, Harold. I don't plan on discussing what's gone on in this house in the last half a century." I beggared off to the adjoining kitchen whilst Our Doris fiddled in the sitting room. I should have been prepared, but I'm not sure trained Marines could have entered that kitchen without having to step back and take a breath. There was this odour of pork left too long in the sun. Greasy pans filled the sink. Eggshells and banana peels and crisp packets spilled out of the bin onto the cracked tiles. If Kim and Aggie were in there, they'd have found enough microbes on the counter to quarantine the kitchen. It were awful, but it suited Janice Dooley right down to the words on her novelty white bottle holder. "One more glass of red and those pots will be forgotten," complete with scrawled woman. I weren't too focused on the kitchen, if I'm being honest. Instead, my eyes were on the fridge. A bare-chested, muscular man. He must have been airbrushed. I were fit when I were younger, but this fellow were built like a Kendall. I doubt he'd ever seen a hamburger. He were the main focus on a flyer for an escort agency. The phone number had been circled in black biro and a name written on top surrounded by hearts. Calvin. If Janice Dooley of Little Street were after him, he'd need the bleeding muscles. I called through the door to Our Doris and said, "Come have a look at this, Our Doris." She were like a bloodhound in the kitchen. The look didn't cross her face. Instead, she smirked and got her phone out of her handbag. As she snapped a few pictures on her camera, she said to me, "If you've proved anything to me today, Arold, then it's that there's a reason I married you." And then the voice sneered behind us. One of those voices that makes your hair stand on end and you're shrivelling on yourself. And Janice Dooley said to us, she said, "If you wish for the name of my kitchen fitter, you could have just asked." She changed into a white blouse and grey pencil skirt, her hair tied up in a bun that revealed how much of her greying hair were really missing. Our Doris stared at Janice with a look of utter vehemence. Honestly, I thought it might have stripped the wallpaper, it was that fiery, and she said to Janice, she said, "Which scrapyard do you use? I've never seen this class of corrugated steel in a kitchen before. I had a man put it in for me. I thought you came about the garden safari." Our Doris pursed her lips and returned phone to handbag. She said, "I did. I believe that you have made nothing short of a mockery of the garden safari and are taking the opportunity to further what can only be a rather abysmal career. I'll have you know I was Miss December in the Gadsden and Taylor calendar in 1972. And if there's anything I've learned from the garden safari, it's when a flower needs pruning, and your petals drooped a long time ago." Our Doris stepped past Janice and I followed her towards the front door. As we left, she turned back and said to us, she said, "Thank you for the hospitality, Miss Dooley. Your home is nothing short of an experience. Something like a Tracy Emin installation. Minus the artistic integrity, of course." And with a firm click of the door, our Doris let herself into the street, head held high, and said to me, she said, "Now, Harold, I think it's time I spoke to the editor of the Partridge Mews Gazette." Next week, the Gazette reported of how Janice Dooley of Little Street had hired an escort in order to try and con Gaston and Taylor with a fake heir. Our Doris carted me down the church hall to listen to Janice's statement about the goings-on. It looked as though the entirety of Partridge Mews had travelled to the church hall. No wonder our Doris had arrived an hour early. Janice Dooley stood at the podium in a tweed two-piece a few sizes too large for her, and she addressed us all with something just short of a stutter. She said, "It's with great regret that I must inform you of my intention to step down as head of the garden safari, a position I only received due to the forethought of Mrs. Violet Grey, the former head who has kindly agreed to take back the reins and—" Janice stopped mid-sentence and glared down at our Doris, who returned the look with what could only be described as supercilious, and she exclaimed, Janice practically screamed, "Beggar this! The whole reason I was given this position was because Violet Grey wanted me to keep Doris Copeland in her place, and chose me because I've been having an affair with Doug Gray since 1983. You could have heard a pin drop in the room as Janice stormed off stage and pushed her way through the crowd, but she was held at bay. I watched her go, not noticing that our Doris had risen from her seat and ascended to the podium until she offered a polite cough into the microphone. The hall turned back as our Doris said to them, she said, "I am sure we can all understand Mrs. Dooley's pain at losing such a prestigious position due to her wrongdoing. It is often the stress of these situations that makes one resort to such drastic measures. I myself made a slight faux pas when it came to a reporter from the Partridge Mews Gazette. But we must remember that all publicity, however good or bad, is publicity for the garden safari. Miss Dooley might believe that drawing the attention to such an upstanding member of our community as Doug Gray will lessen the harsh state of her actions. However, we mustn't forget that it is only recently she tried something similar against the good memory of Mr. Gadsden, who many of us will remember as a great friend and confidant. You will all join me in wishing Miss Dooley all the best in the future, and pray that she considers the consequences of her actions. After all, who are we, if not a forgiving community?" A thunderous applause greeted our Doris as Janice Dooley raged further and surged through the door of the church hall. I looked up at our Doris in all her glory and felt something like fear, but at that moment I couldn't have been prouder. She'd done what our Doris does best. She'd won this round.